All right, so this next lecture is really the high point of the Renaissance, of the sort of climax, and then beyond this, we'll talk about the Renaissance in Europe and the rest of Europe in on Thursday. But this is really the high point, and beyond here in Italy, we're going to start to transition into the Baroque after this. And this is St. Peter's, going a little bit ahead here, of course, of how this is going to develop and turn out. But we're going to start with a few other projects of the early Renaissance, or actually middle or high Renaissance. We'll go back to Giorgio Vasari. I mentioned him a little bit when we talked about the fresco inside the dome at Florence. This is an image of him, probably a self-portrait. Great artist. He also wrote his own book, The Lives of the Most Excellent Painters, Sculptors, and Architects, published in 1550, and really is considered, because of this work, one of the first art historians. He is the person who coins the term Renaissance, and also coins the term Gothic. Northern European builders in the medieval era did not call their architecture Gothic. They just called it modern architecture, right? And they didn't name for it. It was just architecture. But you know, Vasari said, "Hey, we're creating a renaissance of antiquity," and that name stuck. And he contrasted that with the sort of barbaric architecture, especially of Northern Europe, where these territories of the old Germanic barbarians that were the bane of the ancient Romans, right? Always invading. They were uncouth, they were uncivilized, and so forth. And so he, one of those tribes had been the Goths, and so he started that architecture of Northern Europe, not Roman, Gothic architecture, and that's where we get that name from. Here is, just as a reminder, here is the Last Judgment from the frescoed domed ceiling at Florence Cathedral. Really an incredible masterpiece of fresco work and artistry as well. But he also was an architect, and he is responsible in 1560 for the Palazzo Uffizi in Florence. So we're going back to Florence here, still a very significant place. You may know the Uffizi as one of the most important art museums in the world, one of the greatest art, and Renaissance art, you go to the Uffizi for sure. But it was started as a palazzo for the Uffizi family, and then later converted into an art gallery. And this is both an important work of Renaissance architecture, the facades of the palace here, but really also as a work of urban planning. And the Renaissance architects really had a devotion to urban planning as well as just buildings and facades. The site is between the Palazzo Vecchio, pointer, the Palazzo Vecchio here, obviously medieval sort of neo-Gothic building, and the Arno River, which is behind in this image here. And it's a major pathway, and Vasari sort of turns a traditional design of a palazzo in on itself, or outward on itself, where normally, right, you have the public space around the perimeter on the outside of the building, and then you have a private inner courtyard. Well, here we have the public space is in the courtyard in the middle, slices right through, and the public facades are really what would normally be where the inner private courtyard is. And so it's a masterstroke of urban planning for this. The architecture is pretty straightforward Renaissance architecture, like we have been discussing. It's tripartite. There's a ground floor base with a loggia. Instead of arches, now we just have Doric orders with a classical entablature, and then we've got two more levels above that. We kind of have almost a half level as well. We have a projecting cornice, we have engaged pilasters. You can see, let me go to the some elevation view here. We see over the windows are classical, both triangular and circular pediments. We see, the classical pilasters in between the belt courses, and kind of cut off here at the top is the projecting cornice. So pretty traditional, developed Renaissance facade, but it really is the urban planning that is so significant here. So here we're looking in the opposite view from the Palazzo Vecchio, looking towards the Arno River. And at the very end is essentially a Roman triumphal arch that the people can walk through. And then on the second and third floor is a bridge way that connects the two sides of the palaces. And even today, you go from one side of the Uffizi to the other side, you go across one of these two levels here. So it really is an incredible work of planning here. There's a detail of that connection. It's designed like a triumphal arch. We've got this center arch in the middle, and then we got the two sides, just like the Arch of Constantine might have had. And then open classical facades. Also take a look at this window. We're going to be talking more about this form where we've got this circular that it's almost repeated. The triumphal arch is repeated here in the window, where we have the taller rounded arched center window flanked by two squared off windows separated with classical columns. And on the back side, if you're viewing from the river, we see it project over the public street with some vaults, essentially domed vaults, and again, more of these triumphal archways. And this, again, is a completely public element that the Uffizis provide to the people of Florence. Is, when you're walking along here, you have a covering. This is not private. This is a public roadway or walkway now. And so, it's essentially a very wealthy family saying, hey, we're going to do something positive for our community, just the way people, with money give to charities or something now, or sponsor buildings at universities or medical centers or something like that. This was a way for them to endear themselves with the people and say, hey, yeah, don't begrudge us all our wealth. We're going to give some of it back to you in this public no mistaking the grandeur of the palace that they lived in as you walked through that courtyard, but at least they were offering something to people. All right, let's talk a little more about Raphael again. We saw him as a great painter, but he also was an architect, not as well known for that. Here's his self-portrait again. Here is one of his paintings, The Marriage of the Virgin. And I like to show this because, again, we see a great perspective that Brunelleschi had developed, but we see another Tempietto, not quite the Bramante's and not nearly as well proportioned and detailed as Bramante's Tempietto, San Pietro al Montorio, but it has a dome sitting on a classical drum with a colonnade surrounding that. So that Tempietto that Bramante had done was very influential to future architects, for sure. One of the major works that Raphael completed is the Villa Madama from 1516. Unfortunately, it didn't really get completed. It was a very grandiose a villa is essentially a palazzo in the country, right? So it's a palace, not in the city, it's out in the countryside, so you call it a villa. And this becomes a common theme in the Renaissance and Baroque era by very wealthy people. Just like today, people want to get a vacation house in Wisconsin or Michigan or something like that. Same thing, hey, I want a place outside of the city. I'll build myself a villa. And so the Madama family hires Raphael in 1516. I don't remember why, but they ran out of money. Something happened, and only part of the project was completed. So in this plan, we see the light gray is designed by Raphael, but was never completed, and the dark black is the only portion that was actually built. So what we see is a central round courtyard. So again, we see some of that influence of Bramante's Tempietto. And off to the one side that is completed, right in this area here, just right of center, is a grand gallery, a vaulted space that is going to be this massive gallery. And that overlooks a walled garden here. Very Renaissance garden, very symmetrical with a, very orderly, very typical of the Renaissance. What's not completed is this almost amphitheater up here on the top side, and on the left is a grand staircase leading down to another walled garden area. And in the section you can see a little bit, here's the part of the rounded courtyard, here's the grand gallery that he builds, and then these are the terraces of the walled garden he completes. I'll show you a couple of images of it. This is a view of the Rotunda Courtyard, and you can see typical Renaissance. He's got entablatures over the doors and windows and some engaged pilasters that are classical. Nothing super fancy, to be honest, but the gallery is pretty exquisite and probably frescoed by him as well. And this is like a Roman basilica space, but now used in a private residence. And so it's this grand hall with vaulted ceiling, dome ceilings, and all of that. The early Christians had adopted it. Now we see wealthy patrons adopting it just as a space to live in. This is a party room. There's no seat of power. There's no, laws being passed here. There's no masses being given as in a church. This is just a place to have a party. And we begin to see the ostentatious, just immense, portrayal of wealth here that is being provided. Although, again, ironically, they ran out of money or something happened to the family because they did not complete it. A smaller example, and not quite a building, but a chapel within Santa Maria del Popolo, the Kiki Chapel. This is from 1516. Who told me at the beginning, the first day when we did our introductions, who was it who said they were just watching the movies, the Angels and Demons movie?
I was watching it.
Yeah, so you should recognize this if you were watching that movie. The Kiki Chapel was featured in, and a lot of what we're talking about was featured in the movie Angels and Demons, based on the Dan Brown book, which is totally fictional, but is kind of a great movie to watch for Renaissance and Baroque architecture in Rome. So this is a chapel within Santa Maria del Popolo, and for the Kiki family, this would be a private chapel where they could worship in private. We saw an example of that last week by Brunelleschi in Florence, but it also would be a tomb. So as the patrons of the family would pass away, they could be entombed in the chapel as well. And they hire Rafael in 1516 to design this, and it is exquisite. It really shows a masterpiece of more interior design, but of Renaissance classicism. We have these rounded Roman arches, we have the engaged pilasters, beautiful fresco work by Raphael, but he introduces something completely non-Roman, these tombs, which are pyramids, which of course is an Egyptian form. So it's beginning, he's already beginning to break out of the mold of classical Roman antiquity into something that would maybe become more Baroque, as we'll see later. This is actually believed to be the plan that Raphael himself drew up. You can even see the grid lines that he drew. Again, a representation of the importance of geometry. It is an octagon in plan. You can see the four straight sides. Of course, this is the opening, but would otherwise be straight. There's, niches on the angles, but really, you can see that it creates, the four angled sides to create a perfect octagon. And in the center, like any Renaissance building worth its weight, is going to have a dome. So here we see, again, nothing nearly the scale of Florence, but we see a very classical dome sitting on a drum with windows that let in actually a considerable amount of light into this chapel space. And that's something that's becoming more and more important to architects, and we'll talk more about that next week with the Baroque, is the importance of light. So here we see the amazing just natural light that comes in from the drum of the dome. We see some other sculptures that were done later in the Baroque style, but it is just an incredible backdrop designed by Raphael. But then we also have Michelangelo. So here, like I say, he becomes famous for his Sistine Chapel and for his sculpture, but he also is immensely talented as an architect, more so than Raphael. So he wins out on the rivalry as far as architecture. And one of his masterpieces is the Piazza Compedoglio in Rome. He designs it in 1537. Construction doesn't start until 1546, and the paving actually was finished in 1928 under Mussolini, but it was based on the design by Michelangelo. This is a very complex project, and it's really more a work of urban planning with just traditional Renaissance facades placed on it. The Compedoglio is the Capitoline Hill, one of the ancient 7 hills of Rome. It actually overlooks the Forum. At the very top, off to the top, would be where the ancient Roman Forum is, and there's actually a sort of a walkway right along this area here where it's a perfect vantage point to look down into the valley area of the ancient Roman Forum. There was, at the bottom is, another low elevation, and it's, the high elevation is right here at the center. He had a big challenge because this church over here on the left was an existing church, and you can't touch the church. And there was actually an existing building here in the back, and part of his job was to reface the existing building here and then create 2 new buildings to create sort of this trio of buildings with a plaza in the middle. The problem was, because of this existing church, he could not square off in a perfect square or rectangle with this building over here. And because he couldn't do it over here, he decides, you know what, I'm going to angle this building too. So he creates a trapezoid. Again, a strong geometry, but the first time we're starting to see a conscious effort to create a non-orthogonal plan for a space. And it works beautifully. And then the design that doesn't get built till Mussolini's time is this oval paving pattern in the center here, because you can't do a circle now because of the trapezoid form, and so the oval fits in here perfectly. Towards the bottom here, this is the staircase, and you can just make out, if you're looking carefully, the staircase is also a trapezoid. It actually gets wider at the top as you get higher and higher towards the plaza here at the top of the hill. And that has to almost nick off the corner down here of the grand staircase that existed for the existing church. Like I say, it's a really complex plan here. And I'll show you the images, and hopefully it makes sense. So here is an aerial view looking at it from the front side. Here is that staircase that leads up. You can see more clearly here how it's narrower at the bottom and gets wider at the top. And that was partly because he already was going to have to truncate the bottom, clip the corner of this stair here. If he had taken a wider stair all the way down, there wouldn't, you wouldn't be able to have the staircase at all at the base over here. So he had to do that for here, and he had to, clip and sort of angle these 2 buildings because of the church, which is over here on the left. You can just make out the corner of this existing church here. The facades of the buildings are designed by Michelangelo, and they're typical Renaissance. There's not worth discussing. We've covered that pretty well. This is more of an urban planning. So here's the view from the base of the hill as you're approaching, and as you can see, you don't even approach it from a dead-on angle. We're looking almost straight at the facade of the building in the background, but the stair comes off at a slight angle to it because everything is out of whack. And here's the grand staircase, the wide staircase leading up. You can just make out the corner of the church that was existing on the side there. And so as we go a little bit further, and we get to the base of the stair, looking up now at the Compedoglio, we see the grandeur in symmetry. Even the 2 side buildings almost appear orthogonal and symmetrical, even though they're on angles. Here's my wife, Melissa, once again. She was thrilled. We learn about this, just like you are today in architecture school. And, when she first got to see this in 2009, she's like, oh my God, I'm at the Compedoglio. So if you're looking at this going, yeah, whatever, some of us get really excited about this stuff. She's kind of a nerd like I am. She'll admit that. All right, so here, once we are at the top, now we're in the plaza or piazza with the main building and the face here designed by Michelangelo. Very classical, very Renaissance. Again, nothing too out of the ordinary here. It's really the planning. And this is standing looking back now from the main building across the piazza out towards the base of the stair here. We can see a little bit of the church, a little bit of this church right here that's sort of intruding upon this facade of this building here. And really, from the aerial view, we can really see how the plan of the paving unifies this design. There's a lot to criticize Mussolini about for sure, but his implementing, basically paying for this piazza paving to be implemented could at least be one positive thing that he left Italy. There aren't many. And in the center is a actual Roman sculpture of Marcus Aurelius that had survived antiquity, was probably dug out of the ground, somewhere wherever it had been buried for centuries and centuries, probably 1,000 years, and placed at a prominent location right at the center of the Compedoglio. All right, so this really helps put his name on the map, and in 1546 leads to an even greater commission. Remember, in 1513, Julius II dies. The next year, Bramante dies, and construction of St. Peter's grounds to a halt. Well, it can't last. I mean, you got to have, they've torn down half the church. They had gotten the foundations mostly laid by the time that Julius and Bramante had died, and that's it. And so, something has to give. They have to build this thing. And so Michelangelo is now hired to come back. Rafael had died, actually. So now Michelangelo is like the lone remaining figure and really established, even though people still don't like him. But they grudgingly hire this guy because he's the only one they feel is competent enough to finish this project. So 1546, he begins his efforts here. Here again is the plan from 1505 of Bramante's St. Peter's. Greek cross plan, lots of these little niches off to the side and little chapels and so forth. Again, here was his facade rendering, not the most graceful proportion designed. In the meantime, after Bramante died, various popes hired various architects to come up with schemes and designs to continue things, but it never went anywhere. One of those was by Giuliano di Sangallo. This is from 1513. He takes the basic Greek cross plan that Bramante had done and already started the foundations for, and he adds this projecting portico onto the front with two very prominent towers at the front here. Kind of beginning to recognize that maybe we need more of an open area here and an entrance way. Bramante really hadn't figured out a grandiose entrance for it. This is a model, an actual model that he created, still survives. And we see, the facade here, a dome. This has got two drums of a colonnaded dome, a massive lantern on top of it. Not well proportioned, in my opinion. And here is the element he tacks on the front, these two massive towers and this sort of arcaded entranceway here. Michelangelo, not one to mince words, described it as a place where vagrants would hide and rob pilgrims who were coming to the church, because dark nooks and crannies and things like that. So he was not too fond of this. Honestly, it's not a very graceful design. So this never went anywhere either. Rafael actually also got hired. He also came up with a plan for St. Peter's. He again takes a little bit of the Greek cross plan, but he adds a full-on nave to it and side aisles, and says, hey, look, we need more space, actually. He was sort of prescient in thinking that, a Greek cross wasn't going to do it. They needed more space for more people, and decided to create more of a traditional basilica plan, Latin cross with a deeper nave and at least a more formal portico on the front. That also didn't go anywhere, and Raphael died, and the popes didn't have the resources to hire him. So here is Michelangelo's plan in 1546. Michelangelo says, no, I'm going to stick with Bramante's plan. We're going to stick with the Greek cross, and he's already got the foundations in. I don't need to change that. But he did make some key differences and changes. He simplified the space around the main central halls here and the central rotunda dome. And if we compare the two, on the right now is Bramante's plan with Michelangelo's plan on the left. You can see how in these corners he's greatly simplified this. And that has a great advantage because he does know that there's going to be massive numbers of people and then he needs space for that. And these little nooks and crannies here are little tiny chapels. These are not places where people can gather in mass. And so here, this is much more wide open. People can gather more here and it provides a lot more space for people. It's also a much simpler, much more graceful plan ultimately in the end. And in fact, this gets built. This is a view of sort of a side view of St. Peter's as designed and completed by Michelangelo. The plan is based on Bramante, but is distinctly Michelangelo's, and the facades are completely Michelangelo's. So he takes, it's a classical Renaissance facade. He takes these massive pilasters with Corinthian capitals, and the scale here is massive. These. I don't have a good image that shows, people or something down at the bottom. It'd be teeny tiny. This is the top of a light fixture right here towards the left. He's got the classical Renaissance, window and niche openings with triangular and circular pediments. He's got an entablature, and what appears to be more of a parapet wall along the top is really, capping off the top of the building because it's so tall. There's also the dome. I'm going to talk about the dome a little later. So here is a view of the interior as it gets built as designed by Michelangelo. We have, just like we saw with Alberti, this is a Roman vaulted space with the coffers, with the classical pilasters. We see the crossing here. We can see a little bit of the drum of the dome letting in lots of light into the space. The altar piece is later. We'll talk about that later with Bernini. Here's a view looking up at the dome at the crossing. This is based largely on the dome of Florence Cathedral that Brunelleschi had built. Here we see the drum with a classical colonnade and again the pediments of circles and triangles, and then the dome with a lantern on the very tippy top. If you can bear with me just a few more minutes, let me just finish a little bit talking about the dome, and it'll be a good place to stop. Here is Bramante's plan for the dome. This was going to be a more, based on the Pantheon, a spherical dome with this, colonnade around it, a very large lantern. And here is a view of San Gallo's facade with these massive towers and this clunky dome, 2 levels of drum, a massive lantern, and really look how the way these towers really overwhelm the dome. They compete. The dome ought to be the main focal point, and it gets lost between these 2 towers here. Not a very graceful design, to be very honest. This is Michelangelo's design. So here the dome takes the center point. He's got 2 smaller little domes at the front corners, but they complement the main dome. They don't compete with it visually, and they're subservient to it. Now the dome is right over top of the grave of St. Peter's. I mean, it's the symbolic heart of the Catholic Church, and it should be the major feature that you see, and Michelangelo understood that, whereas Bramante and San Gallo, they did not understand the importance of that. And also the proportions are much more graceful. The lantern is smaller, it has a colonnade, but it isn't overwhelmed. You see the dome itself. It's a much more graceful design. And in fact, it gets built the same way that Michelangelo designs it. This actually finished after his death. And they did raise verticality of the dome a little bit, which I think helps. But the lantern is nicely scaled. Here's colonnade that goes around it, around the drum. We see some of the ribs, the same construction techniques that Brunelleschi had used. And here are the two little domes that complement and they're subservient to the main dome. They don't overwhelm it. And here's a drawing, cutaway section drawing of the dome. Just like at Florence with Brunelleschi's dome, it's a double shell. Here's that space in between, the lantern on top and the drum down here. And in fact, just like at Florence, you can take a tour up into the dome at the Vatican too. Here's Melissa once again in the funhouse space. You can see the walls are starting to angle up at the side here, and it begins a difficult little pathway to try to climb up here. And then if you look, I stopped and took a look up. This is that cavity between the two drums, and these are those windows you saw the outside that let light in. That was the only light, originally. Now, of course, they have it wired with electricity, but it is well worth the visit up to the top of St. Peter's Dome, looking out over the Piazza that is later designed by Bernini. We'll talk about that later. Incredible view of Rome. This grand boulevard was also done by Mussolini. He basically said, hey, I'm going to take all your property. I'm going to slice through this straight boulevard leading from the river to the Piazza San Pietro, and nobody could say no to that. It used to be a medieval, winding, meandering streets. My architectural history professor when I was in college hated this. Hated Mussolini too, of course, but he hated the idea that it used to be you would sort of wind your way, and then all of a sudden you would open up into this grand piazza. Now all that sort of excitement and anticipation and that reveal is lost. Once you're down here, you see all the way up. I kind of like the Grand Boulevard because it does kind of emphasize the grandeur of the site. This is the Castel Sant'Angelo that was also in the movie Angels and Demons, and this is the old walls of the Vatican that you can. There was actually a passageway you could walk from the castle to the church. The castle was the site. It was actually an old Roman ruin, and it was the site, the medieval castle of the Pope. This is where they would hide out when the city was attacked. And in fact, that happened every so often. There was some point in the medieval era, there was a massacre of the Swiss Guard, like 1,000 Swiss Guard were killed or something like that. You can just make out the dome of the Pantheon right here, sort of towards the center right. That is the dome of the Pantheon over there. All right, this is a good place to stop.